Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare.
Yesterday at the Zurich temple, a senior disciple of Bhakti Charu Maharaj, an old godbrother of mine, who I'm very grateful to. He was actually right there when my mom was passing away in a coma in a clinic in Lucerne, Switzerland, 20 plus years ago. He was chanting Hare Krishna to her as she was, close to leaving her body. Respect, all respect to him. Having said that, he asked me, because he's part of the temple board, did you give a class? Because as you may know, I gave a Srimad Bhagavatam class. I'm grateful to having had the opportunity to do so a few days ago. And I put on a dhoti because I was asked to, even though I certainly didn't want to. And I think it's a disastrous policy. So he said to me, did you put on a dhoti? Did you give class? I was like, yeah. And did you put on a dhoti? He was so concerned. Did you put on a dhoti? And I was like, yeah, I put on a dhoti. Oh, that's good, he said. And I said, no, I think that's terrible. I think it's disastrous, but, when in Rome, do as the Romans. And then he said this, and this is what I want to talk about. He says, what do you mean it's bad? We have to have standards. We should have standards. We can't just, we should have standards. And this is the point. What constitutes standards for example, giving a Srimad Bhagavatam class in an ISKCON temple? I shot back to him. I said, what do you mean by standards? Are you talking about, that we should all dress like Indians? By the way, I have nothing personal against the way Indians dress in North India or in Bengal or in South India, or however Zulus dress in South Africa, or however, traditional Chinese people dress in Taiwan or mainland China. That's not the point. The point is that we're in Switzerland. We're talking among white, culturally Christian devotees. And I told him, so what's the standard? Is it that we should all dress like, is Indianness, external Indianness the standard? Or is the mode of goodness the standard? And that's what I want to address here. We have to first of all know the difference between, or recognize, verses from Scripture, because we'll all agree that as devotees of Krishna, Scripture is our ultimate authority. Krishna says as such in the Bhagavad Gita, Scripture should be your guiding light. Of the three sources of epistemological authority, namely Sadhu, Guru, and Shastra, Shastra, or Scripture, has the ultimate word. In the introduction to the Sri Ishopanishad, for example, which Param Shreya Prabhu, my friend Param Shreya Prabhu, likes to often quote, there's a passage in there where Prabhupada says, if there's a discussion or a debate between two Hindu gentlemen or two gentlemen from India, following Sanatan Dharma, one will say to the other, I have to accept your authority, or I have to accept your point. Is it stated in Scripture? Is it a Vedic statement? So Scripture is our ultimate authority. So within Scripture, you have descriptive verses and prescriptive verses. Descriptive verses are descriptions of, for example, the Vaikuntha planets, or descriptions, for example, in the 3rd canto, or especially in the 10th canto, about Krishna's Vrindavan pastimes. What Krishna and Balaram did, how the gopis reacted when Krishna came back from the forest, how Nanda Maharaj asked baby Krishna or child Krishna to bring him his shoes, and how they were dressed. Shark-shaped earrings, turbans. Interestingly, the word dhoti supposedly doesn't even show up. The gopis are described as wearing belts. I'm not a Sanskrit scholar, so I'm not going to get into that description. But the point is, these are descriptive verses. Descriptions of Vrindavan, descriptions of the autumn season, description of the spiritual world. Then you have another category of verses that are prescriptive, like a prescription. Do this, don't do that. Sarva dharman parityajya mamekam shararam praja. Yare deka tareka ha Krishna upadesh. Harer nama eva kevalam kalo nasyeva, etc. Do this, do that. Don't do this, don't do that. Prescriptive verses. Why do I say this? Because we tend to conflate both and claim or argue that just because there's some descriptive verses, for example, that describe Krishna wearing a dhoti and the residents of Vrindavan wearing saris and dhotis and so on, because those verses are there, that automatically means that we as sadhakas in human bodies regardless of what race we're embodied in or what place we're living, it doesn't matter. We have to imitate. And the more we imitate those descriptions, the better it is for our bhakti. That's the main argument. So even if you want to call it, it's the look of the spiritual world, you still have the onus. The onus is still on you to prove that, okay, even if that's the dress of the spiritual world and that, putting on dhotis and saris is somehow closer or looks more or looks identical, you'd have to take out a lot of stuff like the socks you wear and the shoes you wear and the cell phone in your pocket and the sweatshirt you're wearing and the computer you're using and the car you're using, and you can basically throw yukta vairagya down the drain. But the more you imitate, the better, the more bhakti points you get. My argument, and this is an argument that Redefining Maharaj makes, which I think is brilliant and very simple, and that if you look at scripture, if you look for prescriptive instructions from scripture, the prescription is not, dress like Nanda Maharaj or like Krishna and the cowherd boys, and the more you do so, the more you have the standard, the temple standard for representing and for giving a Bhagavatam class. No, there's no such statement. Where is the prescriptive statement in scripture to the effect that you have to imitate the way, Krishna and Balaram dress as described in the 10th canto of the Bhagavatam, and when you really imitate like that really well, you've got that nice dhoti and that kurta, which can be argued they didn't even wear that style of kurta 5,000 years ago in Vrindavan, because that's very much of a Muslim Middle Eastern import or export to India that's been appropriated by Indians, local Indians from Bharat or from India, just like the harmonium was appropriated and became an Indian instrument when it actually has its roots in Holland or France. But anyway, putting that aside, Scripture says that the mode of goodness is the standard. The prescriptive, clear as the sun instructions from Scripture for a sadhaka like you and me is live in the mode of goodness, eat in the mode of goodness, dress in the mode of goodness, and add Krishna to the mix. So you could argue, well, no, but don't you understand? Saris and dhotis, that's transcendental, like Devaki Devi Dasi claims in her book, and I made a video on that. Or forget transcendence. Dhotis and saris and kurtas are much more in the mode of goodness than pants and long skirts and everything. Really? That's not what Prabhupada thought. There's a conversation in the Veda base, you can find it, where Prabhupada talks about being dressed in the mode of goodness while one's consciousness is in ignorance. And he's speaking in Hawaii. And he says, speaking about people, non-devotees in Hawaii, so this is 1975 if I'm not mistaken. Obviously in Hawaii there's maybe a handful of Vaishnavas, so the number of people who are actually wearing dhotis and saris, in the 1970s in Hawaii are exclusively members of ISKCON. By the way, interestingly enough, as a tiny parenthesis, if you've heard of Siddha Sarupananda, he left ISKCON with the blessings of Prabhupada, which is very rare. Prabhupada gave him his blessings. It's also there in the Veda base to start his own movement. And one of the main arguments he had from the very beginning was that I don't want to dress like an Indian. And this was way, way, way before Krishna West or any sort of talk like that we hear since 10, 20 years in ISKCON. He was the original Krishna West devotee. And someone like Tulsi Gabbard, the most famous Vaishnavi on planet Earth, who's right there in the U.S. government, and we could criticize her views on abortion or whatever. Politicians are politicians; it's her job. But she's right there in U.S. politics, and she preaches Bhagavad Gita basically in her discourses. She's a product of Siddha Sarupananda's group. So closing that parenthesis, Prabhupada says, you can dress in the mode of goodness, but your consciousness is in ignorance. And so when he's talking about people in Hawaii, they're obviously dressed in Western clothes. So he's taking it for granted that wearing clean Western clothes can totally be clothes in the mode of goodness. So if you're thinking that your Western clothes are somehow inherently and doomed to be always in the mode of passion and ignorance by definition, and that by definition, any dhoti and sari is somehow mode of goodness and, if lucky, transcendental. That's nonsense. That's nonsense. If the clothes are clean and if they're, making you look modest and not attracting undue attention to your physical body, that's clothes in the mode of goodness. It's a no-brainer. So coming back to this point, what should be the standard? What is the scriptural standard for representing properly in terms of your outward appearance when you're giving a lecture, for example, a Srimad Bhagavatam class in an ISKCON temple? Well, according to scripture, we have plenty of references that the mode of goodness is the key. And you can dress in the mode of goodness in Western clothes, just as much as you can dress in the mode of goodness in Indian clothes. So if that devotee was here with me right now, I would ask him that question again. What's the standard? Are you sure you're not mixing ethnic styles of dressing with actual scientific scriptural, foundations dealing with the three modes of nature? Are we establishing Indianness in terms of external looks as the gold standard? And if we're doing that, is that not a mistake? Because can we not argue very clearly that the actual standard for being allowed to represent, visually speaking, the tradition in an ISKCON temple, on the Vyasasana, and I would even say on the altar too, but let's not even go there, is the mode of goodness. So what is the standard? Indian dress or Sattva Guna?